One of the more subtle, but strategically important patterns around Lee Min-ho in the last couple of years is the recurring appearance of historical or period-based projects in his potential lineup, including discussions around works set in the Joseon era, such as Scent of the Night, which he has been reported to be considering, and this recurring proximity to historical roles is not accidental, but rather reflects a structural attempt within the industry to reposition him within a different emotional and narrative framework that contrasts with his established modern image dominance. The logic behind this is relatively straightforward but rarely articulated explicitly. Period dramas impose behavioral constraints that modern settings do not, including rigid social hierarchies, limited emotional expression, and strict codes of interaction, all of which force actors to operate within a narrower expressive range, thereby making subtle variation more visible and more meaningful. And for an actor like Lee Min-ho, whose performances are already associated with control and composure, this environment can either reinforce his strengths or expose their limitations depending on how the role is constructed. What makes historical roles particularly valuable at this stage of his career is that they provide a built-in justification for restraint, meaning that emotional distance is no longer interpreted as a lack of intensity, but as a reflection of the character's position within a structured society, and this reframing can significantly alter audience perception, allowing the same acting qualities to be read differently simply because the context has changed. However, this also introduces a different type of risk, because period dramas rely heavily on internal conflict rather than external action, requiring the actor to communicate shifts in emotion through minimal changes in expression, posture, and timing, and if these shifts are not sufficiently distinct, the performance can appear static rather than nuanced, particularly to audiences who are accustomed to more dynamic storytelling formats. From an industry perspective, the repeated consideration of Lee Min-ho for historical roles suggests that casting directors see this as a viable pathway for recalibrating his image without requiring a complete departure from his established strengths, effectively using the genre itself as a mechanism for transformation. But the success of this approach depends entirely on the script's ability to provide layered emotional stakes that justify the restraint imposed by the setting. For Lee Min-ho, the decision to fully commit to a historical project may represent one of the more effective ways to shift perception without alienating his existing audience, but it will require a level of internal variation that goes beyond what has been seen in recent roles, because in a genre where external expression is limited, every internal movement becomes visible, and the difference between subtle and flat can be extremely small but critically important. This is why the continued presence of historical projects in his orbit should not be seen as coincidence, but as a deliberate structural option, one that could either stabilize his image further or begin to reshape it, depending on how far he is willing to push within the constraints of the genre.